What's up guys, in today's video I'm gonna show you how I turn this render into a much more interesting image. The first thing that you need to know is that I use 3dsMax+corona to achieve this result, which is a mix of a realistic render and a collage sort of thing. In 3dsMax+corona I have many options for render elements, and those are the kind of image that I'm going to use and mix them into Photoshop to make this image. So I don't actually know if other render engines have all these options for render elements. I don't know if you use SketchUp and V-Ray or 3ds Max and V-Ray. I don't know if you have those options, but by seeing these elements that I have here, maybe you can find something similar in your render engine. Another thing that you need to know is that this is a very experimental way of making an image. It's definitely not a step-by-step on how to do this, so those are the things that you need to keep in mind. I have a lot of render elements. First one that I use is the actual render. So as you can see, it's a very simple render. There's not much going on here. I always export a lot of them because I never know what I'm going to actually use. So I put all of these render elements into Photoshop and I start to mix them with each other. The source color is this render without any shadows. It's just the material that I applied in the 3D model. I also use the reflection and this other element that that is called raw components that has only the shadows. So I mix the raw components with the source color to make this kind of realistic render. I also mix the reflection a bit to make a bit more realistic. As I exported without any background, I like to choose a background sky to set the mood of the image. That helps me to understand how the final image is going to be. So often I chose more than one to test it out. So I'm gonna import 3 skies and see what fits best with the render. And I know that I wanted this golden hour type of image with a sunset going on, with a bright yellow glare behind the architecture. So this is what I'm trying to achieve here by testing this ground skies. So once I get the sky that I was trying to, I'm going to mask out the interior of the actual render. The source color doesn't have a nice interior, so I use only this part of the actual render to have a bit of realism, because in the source color map it was all black inside the house, so I needed the information of the interior. So I'm choosing some parts of the render to use, mostly the parts where I have the glass or some reflections that I want for the final image. But the base is the source color, is just the material. Actually, we can make this source color just putting a lot of textures inside of Photoshop. You don't need to render out these textures. I could easily put some wood texture in those breezes or any other texture that I have in the image. Now I'm using the accentual reflection to give some reflections to the metallic parts and the glass and the chimney, and I'm using the shading components to appear a bit of the shadow information. So it's very light. I like to make the shadows very light, so that gives a much more stylized look to the image. If you use very hard shadows, it started to look just like a normal render. I also like to add some noise to the shadows, so it's just going to filter and noise. And of course you have to desaturation because the noise is very colorful. And then I'm use the multiply blend mode to mix the shadow with the source color. I also like to take a bit of the opacity of the actual render that has the information of the interior. And now I'm gonna change this grass material because that was just a improvised one. It's just green. And now I'm going to use an actual photograph of grass to replace that 2D map that I use in the render. I choose this one first, but eventually I'm gonna change the texture because this wasn't high quality enough. You need to find high quality assets to make your image better. So this grass material is very interesting. I like the way the grass is, and it already had the golden sun hitting, so that was nice, but the quality of the image wasn't enough. I also have these ID elements that I can use to make quicker selections, so I use them a lot. This is one element that you have to have because it's so much more easy to make selections. Of course, eventually not always gonna work it out, but it's very helpful in many moments. And I also wanted to replace those 3D trees that I use, so I started to took it off most of them because I was planning to replace them afterwards. And now to give a more 3D-ish vibe to this grass, I use a brush with the shape of a bush to give this 3D look to the grass. So one thing that is missing this grass is the shadows that the architecture casts on it. So I use the raw components as a backplate for the shadow. So the raw components has only the shadows information. So I put this image below the grass texture, and I put the grass in multiply, so that makes the grass texture mixed with the shadow. So I have the same informations, the correct informations of shadows, but it's not that easy. You have to make a lot of replacements. So places where you don't want the shadows, you have to clean it out. But it's a very simple logic. When it's bright, you have no shadows, and if you want shadows, you paint with a darkened color. So I took off those trees that I had there, so I had to clean all the shadows that they were casting. So I was painting with the brightened color. That can be pain in the ass, but the result is very good. You can also use adjustment layers to make the task easier. So when I have those very dark shadows that I wasn't liking very much, I used a levels adjustment so I could control the shadows. So that's one thing that is very, very nice to this technique, because you have all the parts separated. So I can adjust only the shadows if I want, only the reflections, only the textures. You have much more artistic and freedom. So this is the part where I changed the grass material. I replaced the grass that I used before with a much more high quality image. Of course, I use the same mask. So this is a good thing that we have here in Photoshop, working with masks. So I made one mask once, and that allows me to change only the texture and keep the mask. First, I try to use the grass material that I used first in the foreground, but when I zoom in, it was a very different quality compared to the image that I used later. So I eventually have to change it all and use only the second texture that I chose, because it was much more high quality. At this moment, I already have a very interesting image. I think so. You can feel that is realistic, but there's something different with image, and that's feeling that I really like, because it's not hyper realistic. So now I'm gonna think about composition. I really like to make these round backgrounds where the architecture or the pathway goes out of these boundaries. I really enjoy to do this kind of thing. So now that I had a whole image set, I started to think about this kind of composition. So I made this round layer where I can position and see what's best for the image. I had to make the canvas bigger. I needed more space to think about this composition so I can position the round boundaries in a better way. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to leave a like. It helps a lot and it's just one click, so go ahead please. Once I chose the position of the round thing, I just made a selection and I masked out all the things that are passing the boundaries of the round frame. So I made a group for the background and a mask on it, and I also needed to make a group for the grass to clean out all that was trespassing the boundary and also the render. So if you don't want to mess with the masks that you already have in a single layer like that, you can just put it on a group and make another mask. So that way you can do masks on top of masks and so on. I had a problem because the grass texture wasn't enough, so I had to duplicate and to fill this bottom of the circle. And I did some clone stamp work to clean it out, some tiling, some repetitions of the image. And now it's time for the vegetation, because I wanted to fill some places of the image that I thought it was too empty. So I started to choose some trees, some bushes, some flowers. So I dropped everything into Photoshop and start to make the composition. We are dealing with several images that are very different. We have to be careful to color match all of them, to adjust the brightness, the levels of each one of them. I strongly recommend you to, after you position and you decided the size of the image that you are using, to rasterize the layers, because otherwise you're going to have a very massive PSD file. Now that I have my composition, I'm going to work in the light, because I really wanted that bright glare coming from behind the architecture. I found that very appealing to the image. It gives a more dramatic mood to the image that I really enjoy and really like. So it's very simple actually. You can make a layer and to use the simple brush to make the lights and change the blend mode, and you can play with the opacity. I try to give a more golden color to the light, so I painted first with the golden color, then choose the white, choose the overlay blend mode, and started to play with the opacity. In this case I make a copy to use a different blend mode, so I use hard light to make a overall brightness. And of course I made a group, and you can change the blend mode of the group, so that is very nice. I always play with things. It's not a linear development. I always try to make some things different and experiment. I wasn't very happy with the light that was coming from behind the background, so I chose a glare texture that I have to give more emphasis on this dramaticity of the light. So I have this golden glare. And now, as the final part, I convert to a smart object the entire image, and I try to do some things in the camera raw filter that comes with Photoshop. So I really try to make a more contrast image. This is very particular. In each image you're going to approach this differently. So just play with the sliders and see what you get. And the final touch, of course, is to put a human scale, a cutout, to give the scale for the image. Choose wisely, choose some cutout that matches the lights that you have in your image. And to make a more cohesive image at the end, I chose to put a texture on top of the entire image. Of course, you need to be careful with this kind of thing because it might be too distractive. And this is it, guys. This is how I made this image. Like I said many times, this is not a step-by-step kind of tutorial. It's just the way I do this kind of things, and it's very experimental. Every time I made this kind of image is a bit different, but each time you learn something different. Check it out, the other videos that I made, and please consider subscribing, and don't forget to like the video, and I see you in the next time.